In the year 1828, Vienna stood as one of Europe's most prominent cities, not only in the realm of art and music but also as a central hub for intellectual and scientific discovery. Yet, beneath the grandeur of its architecture and the fame of its cultural exports, there was a dark undercurrent that would forever alter the perception of the human mind. Vienna, during this time, became the birthplace of a chilling and controversial chapter in the history of psychiatry, one where the very essence of a person's reality was manipulated, erased, and rewritten. The unsettling tale that began behind the walls of one of Vienna's most infamous asylums remains a mystery to this day. It was here, in an institution designed to heal those who had been broken by the invisible chains of mental illness, that something much darker took root. The room where these events unfolded was known only to a select few, yet it housed some of the most groundbreaking and terrifying experiments in the history of psychiatric care. As science sought to unlock the secrets of the human mind, the doctors and practitioners within these walls began to push the boundaries of morality and ethics in ways that would make even the most hardened researchers of today shudder. The room itself was a place of stark contrast, a supposed sanctuary for the disturbed, yet one that held a power unlike any other. The patients who entered it were not merely treated with conventional therapies. They were subjected to a form of treatment that defied modern understanding, a method that blurred the line between healing and manipulation. The ultimate goal: to alter, erase, or even rewrite the memories of the individuals who were confined within the asylum's stone walls. Memory, the most fundamental element of our identity, became the very tool used in this dark experiment. In the early 19th century, very little was known about how the brain stored memories, how they were formed, or what would happen if they were disrupted. The psychiatric field was still in its infancy, and while some forward-thinking doctors in Vienna were pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge, many others were willing to take risks that, today, would be deemed unconscionable. But back then, the desire to unlock the secrets of the mind often outweighed the moral considerations of how these secrets were obtained. The idea of memory manipulation, of altering what a person could recall of their past, was at the center of the treatments carried out within these walls. In a world where scientific exploration was still attempting to come to terms with the complexities of mental illness, altering a patient's memories became an experiment, one that would forever change not only the lives of those involved but also the trajectory of psychiatric care for decades to come. Imagine a world where everything you thought you knew about yourself was suddenly in question. Where your memories, the very fabric of your past, could be rewritten by a force beyond your control. This was the grim reality for those patients. Doctors would employ techniques like hypnosis, isolation, and various forms of suggestion to manipulate and reshape the memories of those they treated. The results were as fascinating as they were disturbing. Patients left the asylum with identities altered, their histories erased or altered beyond recognition. But why? Why would these experiments be carried out in the first place? The idea of memory manipulation was rooted in the belief that the mind could be reset, much like an engineer resetting a faulty machine. Doctors hoped to cure their patients by erasing the traumatic or disturbing memories that led them to their conditions. However, in practice, these treatments often led to irreversible consequences. The alteration of memories didn't always lead to recovery. It sometimes led to confusion, anxiety, and further psychological damage. As the experiments continued, the asylum room became more and more notorious. The treatments were not always successful, and the patients who underwent these procedures often found themselves lost in a haze of false memories or even complete memory loss. They would leave the asylum not knowing who they were or what their true past consisted of. And in some cases, they never regained their full sense of self. These patients were left wandering through a fog of confusion, their former lives wiped away by the very hands that promised to heal them. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire experiment was the complete lack of accountability. Doctors, who in today's world would have their actions scrutinized and questioned, carried on with their work, convinced they were pioneers in a field that had not yet begun to understand its own boundaries. There were no regulations, no ethical committees to hold them back, and no real oversight. These patients were nothing more than subjects in a scientific experiment, their pain and confusion treated as a necessary byproduct of progress. In a city that had long prided itself on its intellectual advancements, the idea that one's memories could be so easily altered seemed like an impossible fiction. Yet, behind the closed doors of the asylum, such things were happening. Patients were made to believe things that were never true, their pasts rewritten as though they were nothing more than stories being edited and redrafted. And as these practices continued, the question arose: what price did society pay for the pursuit of scientific knowledge? How much suffering was too much when it came to exploring the depths of the human mind? The stories of the patients involved in these experiments remain largely unknown today, obscured by the passage of time and the secrecy that surrounded the asylum's work. Some records were destroyed, while others were never recorded to begin with. The faces of the patients who were subjected to these memory-altering treatments have faded into history, their stories lost to the ages. And yet, the questions remain. What really happened within that room? Were the patients who entered truly healed, or were they irrevocably damaged by the treatment they received? For those who dare to uncover the truth, the answers are elusive. The historical record is incomplete, and much of what occurred behind the asylum walls remains shrouded in darkness. Was it an early attempt at therapeutic intervention, or was it a disturbing experiment that pushed the boundaries of human ethics? In the end, we may never know the full extent of what transpired. But one thing is certain: the legacy of that asylum room in Vienna, and the experiments conducted there, would echo through the annals of psychiatric history for generations to come. As you consider the eerie possibilities of this hidden chapter in medical history, take a moment to reflect on the fragile nature of memory itself. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about your past was suddenly taken from you? Could you trust your own mind if it had been manipulated? And could the very act of erasing memories be a cure or a curse? The questions surrounding this dark episode in Vienna's medical history remain as enigmatic and unsettling as ever, beckoning us to peer deeper into the shadowy corridors of the past. And perhaps, in the process, we will uncover not only the story of the asylum room that rewrote memories, but also a haunting reminder of the lengths to which we are willing to go in our quest to understand the human mind. Vienna, in the early 19th century, was a city of remarkable contrasts, a place where the classical beauty of its architecture, its palaces, opera houses, and grand boulevards, stood in stark juxtaposition to the intellectual and scientific revolutions that were unfolding beneath the surface. It was a time when Enlightenment ideals still clung to the minds of many, but the shadow of Romanticism, with its fascination with the irrational and the supernatural, had begun to take hold. The Age of Reason, with its promise of rational thought and empirical investigation, was now grappling with the emotional and psychological turmoil that defined the human experience. At the heart of this complex city, Vienna was home to some of the brightest intellectual minds of the time, many of whom were trying to reconcile the old ways of thinking with the new scientific discoveries of the age. This period marked a crossroads for psychiatry, which at the time was still very much in its infancy. It was a time when medical professionals were only beginning to explore the depths of the human mind and attempt to understand what caused madness, and more importantly, how it could be treated. In this fertile intellectual environment, mental illness was no longer merely seen as a spiritual affliction or a punishment from the gods. The rise of medical and scientific thinking sought to explain mental disorders in terms of biological, psychological, and even environmental factors. Psychiatry, as we know it today, was still an emerging field. Doctors were groping in the dark, testing out new theories and experimental treatments on patients who were often treated as little more than subjects in the pursuit of knowledge. But despite the era's intellectual promise, there was a darker side to this new age of discovery. The very institutions that were created to care for the mentally ill were themselves places of great suffering. Asylums in Vienna and across Europe were often overcrowded, underfunded, and grim institutions that reflected the harsh attitudes of society toward those who were deemed to be mad. Patients were often isolated from society, left to languish in conditions that were far from therapeutic. Many were subjected to primitive treatments such as bloodletting, leeching, and even physical restraint, all in the name of restoring order to a mind that was believed to be disordered. But Vienna was also a city where the seeds of modern psychiatric care were planted. As early as the late 18th century, figures like Franz Anton Mesmer had begun to challenge the traditional views of mental illness, introducing concepts such as animal magnetism, which suggested that a mysterious force influenced the human body and mind. Though Mesmer's theories were controversial and ultimately discredited, they set the stage for more scientifically grounded approaches to understanding mental health. By the time we reach 1828, Vienna had become a center for new ideas about the mind, where prominent physicians like Johann Christian Ryle and Joseph Gui Slane began to experiment with more progressive approaches to mental health treatment. At the same time, Vienna's cultural and intellectual life was flourishing. The city salons and coffeehouses were teeming with writers, philosophers, and artists, all of whom were fascinated by the mysteries of the human condition. Music, art, and philosophy were all grappling with the complexities of the mind. Ludwig van Beethoven, who had spent much of his life battling deafness and depression, was living in Vienna, and his music was beginning to reflect a deep inner turmoil that resonated with the era's fascination with the irrational aspects of the human psyche. Writers such as E.T.A. Hoffmann explored themes of madness and the blurring of reality and illusion in their works, creating a cultural climate that was ripe for exploring the darkest corners of the human mind. Yet, for all of the intellectual advances of the time, there was still a widespread belief that mental illness was largely an enigma. Asylums, for the most part, had become repositories for those deemed incurable or dangerous. The treatment of these individuals was often haphazard and cruel, shaped by a lack of understanding and empathy. In fact, many of the psychiatric methods that were practiced in Vienna's asylums were still rudimentary, driven more by trial and error than by any scientifically grounded knowledge of the mind. It was within this uncertain and often grim environment that the Vienna Asylum at the heart of our story existed. Built to house the mentally ill, it had become both a place of treatment and a site of experimentation. The doctors and staff were committed to pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge, eager to understand the human mind and its complexities. They believed that through experimentation, they could uncover the causes of mental illness and perhaps even control it. The asylums of the time were not the clean, regulated institutions that we might envision today. Instead, they were often overcrowded and poorly funded, with little regard for the well-being of the patients within. Many of the patients were confined to cramped, dark cells, with limited contact with the outside world. The idea of treating mental illness was still in its infancy, and doctors had limited resources and methods at their disposal. Still, they pushed forward, guided by a conviction that they could cure what they did not fully understand. In this context, it is perhaps not surprising that the room at the heart of our story came to be viewed as a kind of laboratory where the boundaries of the mind were tested. The doctors working there were experimenting with techniques that, today, might be considered nothing short of barbaric. The aim was to manipulate and control the memories of the patients, to see if altering their recollections of the past could have a therapeutic effect on the present condition. What began as an attempt to heal the mind, to rid it of the painful memories that caused mental anguish, would eventually spiral into something much darker. In the context of 1828 Vienna, where scientific exploration was still struggling to come to terms with the intricacies of the human psyche, the idea that memories could be manipulated was not entirely outlandish. Memory itself was not well understood. It was still considered a mysterious process, a phenomenon that had not yet been fully explored. At the time, doctors believed that memory was an almost physical part of the brain, something that could be altered or erased with the right techniques. This misunderstanding of the brain's inner workings would lead to experiments that were both groundbreaking and terrifying. The city's elite medical practitioners, with their minds filled with ambition, were determined to push the boundaries of psychiatric care. The Vienna Asylum, with its complex mix of curiosity and desperation, became a focal point for these early experiments. But while they sought to understand and cure the mind, they were playing with forces they could not control. And as we will see, the very patients they sought to help would become victims of these early, unrefined methods. Vienna in 1828 was thus a city standing at the crossroads of progress and ignorance, a city where the emerging field of psychiatry was attempting to redefine the boundaries of the human mind, sometimes with tragic and horrifying consequences. The early experiments conducted in the asylums of this era, and the manipulation of memory that would soon follow, would go on to shape the future of psychiatry and become a dark chapter in the history of medicine. It was a time when the boundaries of what was possible in the treatment of mental illness were being redrawn, but in ways that many would later come to regret. The Vienna Asylum, where the events we are about to explore unfolded, was a stark and imposing institution. Located in the heart of the city, this asylum had been established in the late 18th century with a mission that seemed progressive for its time, to house those suffering from mental illnesses and provide them with care. However, like many asylums of the era, it became a place where patients were treated more as curiosities or experiments than individuals in need of compassionate care. For those who entered its gates, it was a grim fate, one that would often leave them as little more than subjects in a medical trial. As the years went on, the Vienna Asylum became known as a facility that pushed the limits of psychiatric treatment. The doctors and physicians who worked there were not simply interested in providing basic care, they were seeking to understand the mind in ways that had never been attempted before. These early physicians were driven by a powerful curiosity about the human brain, a fascination that often crossed the line between ethical medical practice and dangerous experimentation. They believed that by probing the very core of mental illness, they could unlock secrets that would revolutionize the field of psychiatry. But their methods were often crude and without the rigorous ethical guidelines we would expect today. The asylum itself was a sprawling, labyrinthine structure, with long, dark hallways that led to rooms where patients were isolated from the rest of society. Patients were often kept in confined spaces, separated from one another, and subjected to treatments that ranged from the relatively benign to the utterly barbaric. The rooms were stark, with cold stone walls and iron bars that emphasized the sense of imprisonment. While the more progressive doctors within the institution were dedicated to studying and understanding mental disorders, others had a far less compassionate view, believing that the treatment of the mind was a matter of control and discipline. Among the key figures in this period was Johann Christian Ryle, a physician whose work in the early 19th century would contribute significantly to the development of modern psychiatry. Ryle's ideas about the nature of mental illness were groundbreaking, advocating for a more scientific and humane approach to treating patients. He emphasized the need for physicians to consider the mental and emotional needs of their patients, rather than simply treating them as objects of study. Ryle believed that the mind was not simply a machine that could be fixed, but a complex, multifaceted entity that required understanding and care. Ryle was not alone in his ideas. Joseph Guy Slane, a Belgian psychiatrist, was another figure who contributed to the evolution of psychiatric care during this period. Like Ryle, Guy Slane was a firm believer in the idea that mental illness should be studied with the utmost care and compassion. He advocated for the use of more humane treatment methods, focusing on the psychological well-being of the patient rather than relying on physical restraint or punitive measures. However, despite their progressive stances, these pioneers were still constrained by the limited knowledge and techniques of the time. Even their best intentions could not overcome the inherent limitations of early psychiatric care. Despite these more enlightened ideas, the treatment methods employed in the Vienna Asylum were still largely shaped by the prevailing attitudes of the time. Many of the patients confined within its walls were subjects of experimentation, often subjected to treatments with little understanding of their effects. Theories about the brain, its functions, and its disorders were still in their infancy, and the methods used to address these issues were often crude and untested. Hypnosis, isolation, and even forms of shock therapy were employed in an effort to reset the minds of the patients and alleviate their symptoms. But as we will see, these treatments did more than just attempt to cure. They often inflicted further harm, leaving the patient scarred both mentally and physically. The specific room within the asylum that became notorious for its experiments was known to only a handful of medical professionals. It was a place where memory manipulation was carried out in the most invasive ways possible. Doctors believed that by altering a patient's memories, they could treat their mental illness and free them from the emotional trauma that seemed to trap them in their own minds. In theory, it was a radical approach to psychiatric care, one that held the promise of reversing the psychological damage caused by repressed memories, traumatic events, or distorted perceptions of reality. But in practice, it often had far more devastating effects. Patients who entered this room were subjected to intense and often unregulated methods that sought to erase or alter their memories. Some of these patients were believed to be suffering from conditions like depression, anxiety, or even psychosis, and the goal of treatment was to cure them by altering their perceptions of the past. Hypnosis was frequently used, with doctors attempting to induce a trance-like state where patients were more susceptible to suggestion. During these sessions, memories could be manipulated, erased, or replaced with false memories that were believed to be more beneficial to the patient's psychological state. The concept behind these treatments was based on a rudimentary understanding of the mind. The doctors who conducted these experiments believed that by removing the psychological baggage of traumatic memories, they could give patients a fresh start, helping them to regain control over their emotions and their lives. The method was seen as an almost miraculous solution to the problem of mental illness, offering the possibility of healing by directly altering the patient's sense of self. It was an idea that seemed, at the time, to have boundless potential. However, the reality of these treatments was far less benevolent. Many patients who underwent memory manipulation emerged from the room with distorted or fabricated recollections of their past. In some cases, the treatments left them unable to recall their own identities, while in others, patients were left with false memories that disrupted their sense of reality. Rather than healing the mind, these experiments often fractured it further, creating confusion and emotional instability that persisted long after the patients left the asylum. Some of the most disturbing stories came from patients who were subjected to these treatments over extended periods. They would enter the room with one set of memories, only to emerge with an entirely different understanding of who they were. Their memories, once the cornerstone of their identity, were wiped away or manipulated in ways that left them questioning everything about themselves. Some could no longer recognize their own families, while others began to believe they had lived lives that never actually happened. This manipulation of memory caused irreparable damage, often leaving the patients in a state of profound distress. For those who were treated with such invasive methods, the consequences were often far-reaching. Not only did they lose touch with their pasts, but they were also deprived of the very thing that allowed them to make sense of their lives. Their memories were the thread that connected them to their identities, and once that thread was severed, they were left adrift in a sea of confusion. These patients became, in a sense, fractured versions of themselves, unable to reconcile the manipulated memories with the truth of their own lives. Despite the profound harm these experiments caused, the doctors involved were not discouraged. Many of them believed that they were pioneers in a new frontier of psychiatric care, convinced that their work would eventually lead to a breakthrough that would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. But in reality, these experiments revealed the dangers of meddling with the human mind without fully understanding its complexities. The line between healing and harm had become blurred, and the patients who entered the asylum's treatment rooms were left to bear the consequences of these well-meaning but misguided efforts. The Vienna Asylum, with its ambitious doctors and its dark history, became a symbol of both the promise and the peril of early psychiatric care. The experiments conducted there, while groundbreaking in their scope, ultimately highlighted the risks of overstepping the boundaries of medical knowledge. It was a place where the human mind was treated as a malleable object to be shaped and molded, and the consequences of this treatment left deep scars, both on the patients and on the field of psychiatry itself. The Vienna Asylum's legacy, as we will see, is one that reflects the dangers of unregulated experimentation and the ethical questions that continue to haunt the field of mental health to this day. Memory, that intangible thread that connects our past to our present and shapes our sense of self, was, in the early 19th century, a largely mysterious and misunderstood concept. The scientific understanding of memory, how it was formed, how it worked, and what happened when it went awry, was in its infancy. The mind was still an enigma, and the very idea that memories could be altered or erased was not only speculative, but in many ways, unfathomable. Yet, the doctors in Vienna, experimenting with some of the earliest forms of psychiatric care, believed they could unravel the mysteries of memory itself. During this time, the prevailing view was that memory resided within the physical structure of the brain, but how it operated remained a puzzle. Physicians were just beginning to study the connections between the mind and the brain. Theories about memory were influenced by the growing body of work in the fields of neurology and psychology, yet the understanding of how and why memories were stored was rudimentary at best. The very fabric of the mind, the way we hold on to experiences, form identities, and make sense of our personal histories, was still shrouded in darkness. One of the most influential theories of the era came from Franz Anton Mesmer, whose work, though later discredited, set the stage for early ideas about the brain's susceptibility to external influences. Mesmer proposed that the human body was governed by a mysterious force he called animal magnetism, which he believed could influence a person's thoughts and physical health. Though his theories were rooted in the belief that human beings could be manipulated through unseen forces, Mesmer's work was a precursor to the idea that the mind could be shaped and controlled. Mesmer's techniques, such as hypnosis, would later be experimented within asylums like the one in Vienna. In Vienna, the early 19th century physicians began to integrate Mesmer's ideas with their own burgeoning theories about the brain and memory. They saw memory not as a static archive but as something fluid, an entity that could be reshaped, altered, or even erased. The mind, in this view, was a canvas, and memories were simply the images painted upon it. If the images were problematic, if a person's memories caused psychological distress, then perhaps they could be repainted. The idea was compelling, especially to those who were experimenting with new treatments in the field of psychiatry. If memory could be manipulated, so too could a patient's experience of reality. But the idea of altering a person's memory, of changing the very building blocks of their identity, was an ethically precarious one. No one fully understood the long-term consequences of such an intervention, and the methods being employed in Vienna at the time were as crude as they were invasive. In the absence of modern neuroimaging or psychological testing, the treatment of mental illness was still highly experimental. The techniques used to manipulate memory were based more on theory than on any solid understanding of how the mind actually worked. One of the primary methods used to alter memory was hypnosis, a technique that was gaining popularity among physicians in the early 1800s. Hypnosis, or mesmerism, as it was sometimes called, was believed to place a patient into a trance-like state in which they could be more easily influenced by suggestion. The belief was that in this state, a person's defenses were lowered, and their subconscious could be accessed. Doctors saw this as an opportunity to rewrite memories, erasing traumatic experiences or changing the way a person recalled their past. The patient, under hypnosis, might be led to believe they had never experienced a particular trauma or that they had lived a completely different life. The use of hypnosis in memory manipulation was seen as a breakthrough at the time, offering a new way to treat mental illness. Doctors thought that if a patient could forget painful memories, they might be able to move past their mental anguish and recover. Traumatic events, once removed from the patient's memory, could no longer haunt them. But the process of erasing or altering memories raised profound ethical concerns. While the intent was to heal, the consequences of such an intervention were often unpredictable. In many cases, the patients who underwent hypnosis found that their memories were not erased but instead replaced with false recollections, memories of events that had never occurred, or identities that had never existed. The manipulation of memory was not confined to hypnosis alone. In fact, a variety of other techniques were employed to try and reprogram the brain. One of the most controversial methods involved isolation. Patients were often placed in solitary confinement, cut off from all human interaction, in the belief that this would force them to confront their own minds. The idea was that by removing the external stimuli, the patient's internal world would be exposed, allowing the doctor to directly intervene in the shaping of their memories. This was a form of sensory deprivation, and while some doctors believed it could help patients regain control over their emotions and thoughts, it was an extremely cruel and damaging practice. The isolation created a state of confusion and disorientation in many patients, leaving them in a psychological limbo where their sense of reality became increasingly unstable. Other techniques included shock therapy and extreme suggestion. Doctors, without the modern tools of neuroscience or the ethical frameworks that govern contemporary medicine, believed they could shock the brain into submission. The idea was that by introducing a jolt to the nervous system, they could disrupt existing memories and reset the brain's neural pathways. Whether it was through physical shock or psychological suggestion, the goal was to interrupt the natural process of memory formation, which doctors believed would allow them to fix the mind. Yet, even as these treatments were being employed, it became clear that manipulating memory in this way came with dangerous consequences. Patients who had undergone hypnosis or isolation often experienced severe emotional and psychological turmoil. Rather than erasing their trauma, the treatments often deepened it, causing patients to spiral further into confusion and despair. In some cases, patients left the asylum with entire blocks of their personal history erased, or with false memories implanted that caused them to question their identity and sense of self. These interventions did not restore their sense of reality, they destroyed it. The manipulation of memory, once seen as a potential cure for mental illness, began to unravel into something far more sinister. The patients who were subjected to these methods became victims of a medical system that, despite its best intentions, had overstepped its boundaries. The idea that a doctor could erase or alter a patient's memory, shaping their reality according to a clinical need, was not only deeply flawed but dangerous. What the doctors failed to understand at the time was that memory is not merely a collection of facts, but a deeply personal, interconnected part of the self. To erase or manipulate those memories was to attack the very core of a person's identity. In the absence of modern understanding of the brain's complexities, these early physicians could not predict the long-term effects of their experiments. They were working with little more than theories and a belief that the human mind could be easily controlled, but the truth was much more complicated. The consequences of memory manipulation were more profound than anyone could have anticipated, and the patients who underwent these treatments were left to bear the brunt of their doctor's ignorance. Instead of offering healing, these experiments left a trail of devastation, leaving patients unable to trust their own memories, their own experiences, or even their own minds. As the doctors in Vienna continued to experiment with memory manipulation, they were unaware that they were not only altering the minds of their patients but also redefining the boundaries of what psychiatry could and should be. The very nature of memory, once seen as a stable and reliable component of human identity, was now in question. In their efforts to cure, they had begun to unravel the fabric of what it meant to be human. The line between healing and harm had been blurred beyond recognition, and the consequences would echo through the annals of psychiatric history for generations to come. As the early 19th century unfolded in Vienna, the growing interest in the mind and its mysteries led to the development of increasingly radical treatment methods. The concept of memory manipulation, though still in its infancy, was already beginning to take shape in the hands of pioneering doctors who sought to control and reshape the very essence of the mind. It was in this environment of experimentation, when knowledge was limited and ethics were often overlooked, that the Vienna Asylum became the focal point for one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of psychiatry. The asylum's rooms, originally intended for healing and care, would become spaces where the manipulation of memory was carried out with a disturbing and disorienting abandon. These experiments, driven by the promise of curing mental illnesses by altering the very memories of patients, would not only lead to unforeseen consequences but would also reveal the dark side of medical experimentation. The idea that memories could be altered in any meaningful way was initially seen as a bold and innovative approach to mental health treatment. Doctors who experimented with this technique saw it as a means of providing their patients with a clean slate, free from the burden of traumatic memories or distorted recollections of their past. It was an idea rooted in the belief that mental illness could be reset, much like a machine, through the removal or alteration of the psychological weight carried by the memories of a patient. To the doctors working in the Vienna Asylum, this seemed like an ideal solution to the complex and often overwhelming nature of mental disorders. The notion of resetting the mind was a tantalizing one. For those suffering from mental anguish, memories of past trauma, abuse, or loss were seen as the root cause of their pain. By eliminating or altering these memories, doctors believed they could free their patients from the psychological prison of their past. They began to experiment with various methods to induce this memory alteration, with the most prominent being hypnosis, isolation, and suggestion. These were the tools that they hoped would unlock the power to cure mental illness. The first and most significant method employed was hypnosis. Mesmerism, a technique that had gained popularity in Europe decades earlier, had laid the groundwork for what would become the standard practice in the Vienna Asylum. Hypnosis was seen as a way to access the subconscious mind, where doctors believed the root of the patient's disorder lay. The idea was that by inducing a trance-like state, the patient would become more susceptible to suggestion, and the doctor could alter the memories that were believed to be causing distress. The use of hypnosis for memory manipulation was seen as a breakthrough, promising a cure for patients who had been resistant to traditional treatments. Doctors believed they could erase traumatic memories or even implant false ones, memories that were believed to be healthier or more conducive to recovery. The practice, however, was fraught with dangers. The ethical concerns surrounding the use of hypnosis were profound. A patient under hypnosis was vulnerable, their defenses lowered, and they could be led to believe or remember things that had never happened. In this state, the line between reality and suggestion became dangerously blurred. While some doctors may have intended to provide their patients with relief from the trauma they had experienced, others saw hypnosis as a tool for controlling the mind, bending it to the will of the practitioner. It was, in essence, an act of psychological manipulation, one that could easily cross the boundaries of medical care and become a form of psychological abuse. The patients who entered the Vienna Asylum in search of healing often left with their memories in shambles. Under hypnosis, their minds were rewritten in ways that were beyond their control. Some patients were made to believe that they had never experienced traumatic events, while others were led to accept false memories, memories of events that never occurred, of lives they had never lived. The impact on these patients was profound. The memory, once a reliable and integral part of their identity, was now fluid and malleable, easily reshaped by the doctors who claimed to know what was best for them. But hypnosis was not the only method employed in the Vienna Asylum. Isolation, a technique rooted in the belief that complete withdrawal from the external world would allow patients to confront their inner turmoil, was also widely used. Patients were placed in solitary confinement, removed from all human interaction and stimulation. The doctors believed that in isolation, the mind would be forced to face itself. Without distractions, the patient's inner thoughts and memories would rise to the surface, allowing the doctor to intervene and manipulate them. It was a brutal and disorienting process, designed to break the patient down in order to rebuild them anew. The idea of isolation was predicated on a simplistic and dangerous understanding of the mind. It ignored the fact that human beings are social creatures who rely on external support and interaction to maintain their mental health. The isolation not only created extreme distress and anxiety in the patients, but also had the effect of heightening their sense of confusion and helplessness. The patients, deprived of normal human contact, began to lose touch with reality. Their memories, once stable and coherent, became distorted as the isolation deepened. For some, the trauma of being cut off from the outside world for extended periods of time was itself a source of mental deterioration. In addition to hypnosis and isolation, suggestion played a central role in the memory manipulation experiments carried out at the Vienna Asylum. The doctors believed that they could implant new memories into the minds of their patients, memories that would provide a more positive or therapeutic narrative. This was done through a series of carefully structured suggestions, where patients were told what they should believe, what they should remember, and how they should interpret their past experiences. The power of suggestion was harnessed in an attempt to create a new, more manageable reality for the patients, one that was free from the pain and confusion of their former lives. The results of these experiments were often disastrous. While some patients were left with memories that had been erased entirely, others were given entirely new lives to live, with memories of events that had never occurred. A patient who had suffered the loss of a loved one might leave the asylum believing that the loss had never happened. A woman who had been the victim of abuse might emerge with no recollection of the trauma, but also with no real understanding of her own history. It was a cruel irony. The attempt to heal the mind by altering its memories resulted in patients losing their very sense of self. The patient's identities became fragmented, their understanding of their own past distorted beyond recognition. The very foundation of who they were, built on memories, experiences, and personal history, was eroded, leaving them adrift in a sea of facades and confusion. For some, the consequences of these memory-altering experiments were even more tragic. In the case of certain patients, the alteration of memories did not lead to healing, but rather to a deepening of their psychological scars. The experience of having one's memory tampered with created a sense of profound disorientation and alienation. Patients who had been made to forget painful experiences found that they could no longer trust their own minds. Memories that had once anchored their sense of self were now either gone or replaced with lies. They were left with a fractured identity, unable to reconcile the distorted recollections implanted in their minds with the reality of their past. The Vienna Asylum's experiments in memory manipulation, though initially seen as revolutionary, ultimately exposed the terrifying potential for harm when science is applied without an understanding of its full consequences. The doctors, driven by the belief that they were on the verge of a groundbreaking discovery, failed to account for the profound psychological damage that their methods would cause. In their quest to cure their patients by altering their memories, they had created a new form of suffering, one that left their patients with nothing more than shattered fragments of a past they could no longer trust. What was supposed to be a treatment, a cure for the mind's ailments, became a dangerous foray into the unknown, revealing not only the fragility of the human mind but also the moral and ethical limits of medical experimentation. The patients of the Vienna Asylum, subjected to these memory-altering practices, paid the ultimate price for this reckless pursuit of knowledge, and their suffering serves as a stark reminder of the peril that exists when science oversteps its boundaries. As the experiments in the Vienna Asylum continued, the darker implications of manipulating a patient's memories began to unfold. The very fabric of identity, once thought to be firmly anchored in a person's recollections and experiences, was now being pulled apart. The doctors who had once believed they were unlocking the mysteries of the mind were now faced with the unsettling reality that they had unleashed a torrent of psychological chaos upon their patients. What they had intended to be a breakthrough in psychiatric care, an innovative treatment that could reset the mind, had instead become a Pandora's box, revealing the fragile nature of the human psyche and the risks of tampering with it. One of the most disturbing aspects of these memory-altering experiments was the profound impact they had on the patient's sense of self. For many individuals, their memories were the very foundation of their identity. The events, experiences, and relationships that shaped their pasts gave them a sense of continuity, a way of understanding who they were in relation to the world. To erase or manipulate these memories was to erase a part of their very existence. The result was a loss of personal coherence, leaving patients adrift without the solid ground of their own history to stand on. For those subjected to the treatments in the asylum, this loss of identity was not just a theoretical or abstract concept, it was a harsh and tangible reality. Patients who had undergone memory manipulation found themselves in a state of profound confusion. Some had their traumatic memories removed, while others were led to believe they had never experienced certain events at all. Still others had entirely fabricated memories implanted, changing the course of their lives and relationships in ways that they could not understand. The sense of disorientation that followed was all-consuming. In many cases, patients no longer recognized themselves. The memories that once served as a guide to their past were gone, replaced by falsified recollections that had no bearing on their actual lives. The emotional toll on these patients was devastating. Instead of feeling liberated from the burden of painful memories, many were left to grapple with the unsettling reality that their minds no longer felt like their own. A person whose memories had been altered might leave the asylum convinced of a past that had never happened, believing they had lived an entirely different life, with different experiences, different relationships, and different struggles. The resulting cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These patients could not reconcile the false memories that had been planted in their minds with the reality of their lives. They were haunted by memories that were not their own, and the trauma of living with these manufactured recollections often caused even deeper psychological damage than the original mental illnesses. The effects of memory manipulation went beyond mere confusion or disorientation. In some cases, patients experienced severe emotional and psychological distress. A woman who had been made to forget the death of a loved one might find herself unable to process her grief properly, unable to understand why she was feeling lost or empty, because the very experience that should have triggered that grief had been erased from her mind. A man who had suffered abuse as a child but was made to believe it had never happened might begin to question his own emotional responses, unsure of why he felt the way he did or why he struggled with certain relationships. The manipulation of memory also had a deep impact on patients' relationships. Families, once reunited with their loved ones after their release from the asylum, found themselves confronted with individuals who no longer seemed to recognize them, or, in some cases, who seemed to remember entirely different events from the ones they had shared. A wife who had lost her husband to mental illness might find herself reunited with a man who no longer recognized her or their children. A mother might be faced with a daughter who no longer remembered the pain of her childhood, or who had no recollection of the bond they once shared. The disruption of memory did not just affect the patients. It shattered the relationships that had once provided them with a sense of connection and understanding. Families and friends were left to grapple with the painful reality that the person they had known was no longer the same. The doctors who conducted these experiments, for all their ambition and scientific curiosity, failed to grasp the complexity of the human mind and the ethical ramifications of their actions. They were motivated by a desire to find a cure, to unlock the secrets of mental illness, and to push the boundaries of what was possible in psychiatric care. But in their pursuit of progress, they disregarded the sanctity of personal identity and the emotional well-being of their patients. They believed that by altering a patient's memories, they could free them from their psychological pain, but what they failed to realize was that this intervention was in itself a form of harm, one that left deep scars on the minds of those who underwent it. The lack of informed consent also played a significant role in the suffering of these patients. Most individuals who entered the asylum were not fully aware of the risks involved in the treatments they would undergo. In many cases, they were subjected to memory manipulation without any understanding of what was happening to them. They did not have the ability to consent to these radical procedures, and many were not even told what the doctors were attempting to do. The power dynamic between physician and patient in the 19th century was one of complete authority on the part of the doctor, leaving patients with little to no say in the course of their own treatment. This lack of agency only deepened the harm that was inflicted upon them. They were treated as subjects of medical experimentation, their lives shaped and altered by the whims of doctors who, in their own minds, were acting in their best interests. As the years passed, the consequences of these experiments began to come to light. The patients who had undergone memory manipulation often struggled to reintegrate into society. Many found themselves unable to resume their previous lives because they no longer recognized the people or places that had once been central to their existence. The loss of memory had not provided them with a fresh start. It had left them with a fractured sense of self, unable to reconcile their past with their present. Those who had experienced severe memory manipulation found themselves emotionally and mentally unmoored, unable to trust their own minds, and often unable to trust the people around them. The idea of memory as something malleable, something that could be manipulated and altered at will, was not only misguided, it was a profound violation of the personal integrity of the patients who underwent these procedures. The consequences of these experiments were felt long after the patients had left the asylum. The damage to their mental and emotional well-being was often irreversible. Many of these individuals were left to live the rest of their lives in a state of psychological limbo, unable to reconcile the memories they had lost with the life they were now living. In the broader context of medical history, the experiments conducted in the Vienna Asylum became a cautionary tale. They demonstrated the dangers of unchecked medical experimentation and the ethical risks of manipulating the human mind. While the doctors who conducted these experiments may have believed they were on the verge of a great breakthrough in psychiatric care, they failed to consider the human cost of their actions. The patients who became the subjects of these memory-altering treatments were not mere vessels for scientific inquiry. They were individuals with lives, identities, and histories of their own. By tampering with their memories, the doctors had not only failed to cure their patients but had caused them irreparable harm. The legacy of the Vienna Asylum and its experiments with memory manipulation serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of ethics in medical practice. It is a story of ambition, of good intentions gone awry, and of the consequences of pushing the boundaries of science without fully understanding the human cost. The patients who were subjected to these experiments were victims of a medical system that, despite its advances, had failed to recognize the profound responsibility it held toward those in its care. Their suffering, and the lessons learned from their experiences, continue to resonate in the field of psychiatry to this day. As the Vienna Asylum continued its experiments on memory manipulation and the effects of altered consciousness, the medical community slowly began to recognize the troubling ramifications of these practices. What had initially seemed like an exciting avenue for potential breakthroughs in mental health care was now beginning to appear as a cautionary tale of the dangers of pushing the boundaries of psychiatric treatment without understanding the full scope of the consequences. The very notion of memory as a malleable and controllable entity was being questioned, not only for its scientific feasibility but also for its ethical implications. What had been intended as a means of healing became a profound violation of the patient's autonomy, their identities, and their fundamental human rights. In the years that followed, the Vienna Asylum's infamous experiments became a source of growing scrutiny. The doctors and physicians who had conducted these memory-altering treatments, while well-meaning in their pursuit of psychiatric advancements, were now confronted with the undeniable reality that they had overstepped ethical boundaries. Their attempts to cure mental illness through the manipulation of memories had inadvertently caused untold harm. These patients, who had once hoped for healing and relief from their suffering, were now left with nothing but confusion, a shattered sense of self, and a deep psychological scar that would never fully heal. The repercussions of the experiments, though not immediately apparent to the broader public, began to reverberate throughout the field of psychiatry. As the concept of memory manipulation gained traction in the medical community, it soon became clear that the human mind was far more complex and fragile than the early practitioners had understood. The experimenters in Vienna had been among the first to attempt altering the fabric of memory, but their actions, although groundbreaking, highlighted the risks involved in meddling with the most intimate and defining aspects of a person's psyche. Yet, despite the growing awareness of the harm caused, the questions raised by the Vienna Asylum experiments remained unresolved. At the time, there was still limited understanding of the nature of mental illness, and the treatment methods were still in their infancy. The broader medical establishment was at a crossroads. On the one hand, there was a genuine desire to find cures and treatments for the mental health issues that had plagued humanity for centuries. On the other, there was the uncomfortable realization that, in their haste to find solutions, the doctors in Vienna had inadvertently become the perpetrators of a new form of psychological trauma. The ethical implications of the Vienna Asylum experiments were vast and far-reaching. The concept of altering a person's memories, especially without their full consent or understanding, raised fundamental questions about personal autonomy and the sanctity of the individual's mind. Memory is not just a collection of facts or experiences. It is the very thread that weaves together a person's identity. To erase, alter, or replace memories was, in effect, to erase or alter a person's sense of self. This was not simply a matter of physical health or even mental health. It was an assault on the very core of who someone was. In the wake of these realizations, the broader psychiatric community began to reconsider the practices that had been carried out in Vienna. There was an increasing awareness that mental illness, while deeply misunderstood, could not be treated as a mere collection of symptoms that could be fixed through manipulation or force. The mind, it was becoming clear, was not a machine to be reprogrammed, but a living, evolving entity that required careful and compassionate care. The doctors in Vienna, for all their groundbreaking work, had fallen prey to the hubris of believing that they could control and reshape the human mind at will. The consequences of this arrogance were now painfully clear. Yet, as the ethical concerns mounted, the idea of memory manipulation did not simply disappear from the medical landscape. While the practices employed in the Vienna Asylum were gradually abandoned in favor of more humane and scientifically grounded approaches, the desire to understand the malleability of memory and its role in mental illness remained a powerful driving force in the field of psychiatry. Even as memory-altering techniques like hypnosis and isolation were cast aside as unethical, the broader question of how memory influences mental health remained central to psychiatric inquiry. This tension between progress and caution was not unique to Vienna. Across the world, similar experiments were being conducted in other asylums and medical institutions, each exploring different aspects of the mind, memory, and mental illness. While many of these experiments did not reach the same levels of controversy as those in Vienna, they nonetheless raised similar questions about the role of the physician in shaping a patient's experiences and the potential for harm when boundaries are ignored in the pursuit of knowledge. In many ways, the Vienna Asylum became a symbol of the dangers inherent in the early days of psychiatric care. It was a stark reminder that, in the race for medical advancements, the human cost of experimentation cannot be ignored. For all the theoretical benefits that might have been imagined in the quest to manipulate memory, the reality was that the patients subjected to these treatments paid a far higher price than anyone had anticipated. Their suffering, while initially hidden behind the closed doors of the asylum, would ultimately be revealed to the world as a dark chapter in the history of medicine. The story of the Vienna Asylum and its memory manipulation experiments is also a reminder of the importance of ethical oversight in the medical profession. At the time, there were few, if any, regulations governing psychiatric treatment, and doctors were largely free to experiment with whatever techniques they deemed necessary to find a cure. The absence of ethical guidelines allowed for a wide range of practices, some of which, like those in Vienna, would later be recognized as deeply harmful. As the medical field developed, ethical standards for patient care began to take shape, with the understanding that medical professionals have a responsibility to do no harm. The Vienna Asylum story serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when those standards are not adhered to. While the patients of the Vienna Asylum never had the opportunity to speak out about the harm done to them during their treatment, their suffering was not entirely in vain. Their stories, though largely forgotten for many years, eventually became a point of reflection for future generations of medical professionals. The memory manipulation experiments that took place in Vienna would continue to haunt the medical community, serving as a warning about the dangers of overstepping the bounds of medical intervention. The legacy of the Vienna Asylum is a complex one. On one hand, it represents the early days of psychiatric experimentation, a time when the field was still in its infancy, and doctors were grappling with how to treat mental illness. On the other hand, it is a reminder of the profound consequences of unregulated experimentation and the human cost of medical progress. The patients who were subjected to these memory-altering treatments paid a steep price, and their stories serve as an important lesson about the limits of science and the importance of ethical responsibility in medical practice. As time went on, the lessons learned from the Vienna Asylum experiments helped shape the future of psychiatry. New methods of understanding and treating mental illness emerged, ones that were more grounded in scientific research and a deeper understanding of the mind. The idea that memories could be altered at will, that the very essence of a person's identity could be manipulated by a physician, was slowly abandoned in favor of more compassionate and evidence-based approaches. In the end, the story of the Vienna Asylum stands as a dark chapter in the history of medicine, one that forces us to confront the ethical complexities of medical experimentation. It challenges us to ask fundamental questions about what it means to be human, about the sanctity of memory and identity, and about the responsibility of medical professionals to protect and care for their patients. The Vienna Asylum's legacy is one of caution, a reminder that science must always be tempered with humility, and that the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the cost of the very people it is meant to help. As the medical community began to examine the aftermath of the Vienna Asylum's controversial experiments, the growing body of evidence pointing to the harm caused by memory manipulation could no longer be ignored. Yet, despite the painful revelations, the fascination with memory, its malleability, and the power of suggestion persisted within the field of psychiatry. In the years following the asylum's most infamous period, the desire to understand the mind and explore the boundaries of psychological treatment remained a driving force in the medical world. However, the Vienna Asylum's failures became a cornerstone of cautionary tales, one that set the stage for more ethically responsible practices and greater scrutiny of experimental treatments. The ethical questions that arose from these experiments, questions regarding the autonomy of the patient, the potential for abuse in the physician-patient relationship, and the risks of tampering with the psyche, became central to the evolving field of medical ethics. The notion that memory could be reshaped, erased, or even artificially implanted into a person's mind was a powerful but dangerous tool. As time passed, and more patients who had undergone these procedures began to emerge, the psychiatric community was forced to reckon with the profound consequences of tampering with something as sacred as memory. For years, the full extent of the suffering endured by patients in the Vienna Asylum remained largely unknown. The records from that time were sparse, and many of the patients subjected to the memory manipulation techniques were either too deeply affected to speak out or were unable to comprehend the changes in their own lives. Much of the information about the experiments came from posthumous reports, fragments of journals, and the occasional whistleblower who had worked within the asylum. The patients, who were once considered subjects of medical experimentation, became ghosts in the system, those whose suffering was swept aside in the name of scientific progress. However, as the psychiatric field slowly evolved, the horrors of the Vienna Asylum began to surface. Researchers and clinicians, eager to learn from the past, started to carefully examine the consequences of memory manipulation. The emergence of modern psychology and psychiatry, coupled with the development of more advanced tools for studying the human brain, led to a greater understanding of the intricacies of memory, trauma, and identity. It became evident that memories, far from being a simple repository of facts and events, were woven into the very fabric of who we are. They were not mere recollections. They were the threads that connected us to our past, that helped us make sense of our present, and that shaped the future we envisioned for ourselves. It was during this time that the field of psychology began to come into its own as a legitimate scientific discipline. With the advent of more sophisticated methods of research and the development of psychological frameworks such as Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, the focus shifted away from crude and invasive treatments like those practiced at the Vienna Asylum. In particular, the idea of altering memories, whether through hypnosis, suggestion, or isolation, came to be seen as not only ineffective but also dangerous. The ethical and psychological consequences of memory manipulation became central to the field's growing body of knowledge. Psychiatry was starting to understand that altering a patient's memories was not a therapeutic intervention, but a dangerous act of manipulation. One of the key shifts that occurred during this period was the growing recognition that mental illness could not simply be cured by erasing or reshaping memories. The idea that the mind could be reset, that trauma could be erased or rewritten, was a tempting one. But as psychiatry matured, it became clear that mental health was far more complex. Disorders like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder were deeply intertwined with a person's lived experiences. Rather than erasing memories, the focus shifted toward understanding how those memories impacted an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The treatment became less about fixing the mind through drastic interventions and more about helping patients navigate their memories, understand the trauma they had experienced, and integrate those experiences into their lives in a healthier way. While the Vienna Asylum experiments are often cited as an early example of the dangers of unchecked experimentation in psychiatry, they also help set the stage for the ethical frameworks that would later emerge to protect patients from harm. The realization that medical professionals had the power to profoundly alter their patients' memories, and, by extension, their identities, drove the eventual development of ethical standards in medical research. These standards, which emphasize the need for informed consent, respect for patient autonomy, and the necessity of minimizing harm, became fundamental to the practice of medicine. The development of these ethical principles was not without its struggles. For many years, the medical establishment was slow to fully embrace these concepts, and it took several high-profile cases of patient abuse and exploitation to highlight the need for regulation. However, the lessons learned from the Vienna Asylum were crucial in shaping the direction of medical ethics in psychiatry. The story of the patients whose memories had been tampered with became a stark warning. The power of the physician to reshape a person's mind was not one to be taken lightly. What had once been seen as an experimental treatment, a method to cure mental illness, now stood as a glaring reminder of the potential for harm. As psychiatry continued to evolve, new research into memory and the brain helped illuminate the complex relationship between memory, identity, and mental health. The idea of memory manipulation was eventually discredited as a legitimate form of therapy, and the focus shifted toward understanding the brain's actual workings. The development of brain imaging technologies, such as MRI and PET scans, allowed scientists to observe the physical processes that underlie memory, helping to demystify the mechanisms by which memories are formed, stored, and retrieved. Rather than viewing memory as something that could be altered at will, scientists began to appreciate its fragility and its deeply personal nature. Moreover, the rise of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, in the mid-20th century further shifted the psychiatric landscape. CBT emphasized the role of thought patterns and behavior in mental health, rather than attempting to erase memories. Instead of trying to manipulate the past, CBT focused on helping patients recognize and reframe negative thought patterns, allowing them to heal without altering their memories. This approach was far more aligned with ethical standards, as it placed the patient at the center of the therapeutic process and sought to empower them rather than manipulate their internal reality. Despite the growing understanding of the dangers of memory manipulation, the question of how to treat trauma and past experiences remained a central issue in psychiatric practice. Over time, new treatments were developed that acknowledged the role of memory in mental health but did so in a way that was rooted in understanding, compassion, and respect for the patient's personal history. Therapies like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, focused on processing traumatic memories in a way that helped patients heal without erasing or distorting the memories themselves. However, the legacy of the Vienna Asylum and its experiments remained a somber reminder of how far psychiatric practice had come, and how much further it still had to go. The dark chapter of memory manipulation in Vienna became a symbol not just of the failures of medical experimentation but also of the ongoing struggle to balance the pursuit of knowledge with respect for human dignity. The patients whose memories were rewritten, whose identities were fractured by well-meaning but misguided doctors, had become the silent victims of a system that had prioritized progress over care. Their suffering was a necessary, painful lesson that would echo throughout the history of psychiatry. Ultimately, the Vienna Asylum's experiments left an indelible mark on the field of psychiatry. It was a brutal lesson in the dangers of overzealous medical intervention and a testament to the necessity of protecting patients from exploitation. The ethical principles that emerged in the wake of these events would help guide the practice of psychiatry for generations to come, ensuring that patients would no longer be subjected to the kind of reckless experimentation that once defined the early days of mental health treatment. The legacy of those who endured these early experiments is preserved not just in the history books but in the ethical standards that guide the practice of medicine today. Their suffering was not in vain. It became the catalyst for change, forcing the medical community to confront its responsibilities to the very people it sought to help. Through their pain, a brighter, more compassionate future for mental health treatment was forged, a future where the sanctity of the human mind, and the memories that make us who we are, would no longer be treated as subjects for experimentation, but as precious, irreplaceable parts of our identity. The repercussions of the Vienna Asylum's memory manipulation experiments did not merely echo within the walls of psychiatry and medical history, they also reverberated throughout broader society, affecting the way mental health was perceived and treated for generations to come. The story of these experiments, though relatively obscure for many years, would eventually come to represent not only the risks of unethical medical practice but also the larger struggle for autonomy, identity, and dignity within the context of psychiatric care. As society's understanding of the human mind and mental illness advanced, the lessons learned from the Vienna Asylum's dark history shaped the trajectory of modern psychiatric treatments and, more importantly, the ethical framework within which they were practiced. In the wake of the Vienna Asylum's tragic legacy, psychiatry entered a period of deep reflection. The patients who had suffered from the memory-altering procedures were left with fractured identities and confused perceptions of their past. Their lives were irreparably altered by the well-meaning but reckless actions of the doctors who believed they were pioneers of a new medical frontier. These patients were often left in limbo, unable to reconcile the altered versions of their memories with the experiences that had shaped their true selves. For many, the damage was irreversible, and the emotional and psychological consequences of these experiments lingered long after their time in the asylum had ended. While the physical and emotional suffering endured by the patients of the Vienna Asylum is undeniably tragic, the impact of these experiments stretched far beyond the individual cases. They underscored a crucial point about the human mind, that memory, while often seen as a passive repository of information, is in fact an active and deeply integral part of a person's identity. Memories shape the way individuals view themselves and the world around them. They influence how they respond to relationships, how they navigate the challenges of life, and how they cope with adversity. By manipulating a patient's memories, these doctors had not just altered their recollections but had tampered with the very essence of who they were. The ethical violations committed in the Vienna Asylum, while extreme, illuminated the vulnerabilities of patients within psychiatric institutions. At the time, asylums were often places of isolation, where the most vulnerable individuals in society were subjected to the authority and control of medical practitioners who held immense power over their lives. The hierarchical nature of these institutions left patients with little room to question or resist the treatments they were subjected to. This power dynamic allowed doctors to operate with a level of unchecked authority, often at the expense of the patient's dignity and well-being. It was in this environment that the ethical principles that govern modern psychiatric practice began to take shape. The shock of the Vienna Asylum's experiments acted as a catalyst for change, sparking a larger conversation about patient rights, informed consent, and the role of the physician in managing mental health. These early experiments with memory manipulation, though disastrous, contributed to the eventual development of patient-centered care, where the needs, rights, and autonomy of the individual are prioritized. In the decades that followed, the medical community began to adopt more stringent ethical standards in response to the abuses that had occurred. These standards were designed to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable patients and to ensure that their rights were protected during treatment. The principle of informed consent, where patients are fully informed of the risks and benefits of a treatment before it is administered, became a cornerstone of medical practice. It became clear that no longer could physicians impose treatments on patients without their understanding and consent. The Vienna Asylum's memory manipulation experiments had illustrated, in stark terms, the dangers of disregarding a patient's right to autonomy and self-determination. Moreover, the Vienna Asylum experiments also prompted the psychiatric field to reconsider its understanding of mental illness. At the time, mental disorders were poorly understood, and treatments were based largely on trial and error, with little regard for the psychological and emotional needs of the patient. The belief that mental illness could be reset by altering or erasing memories now appeared dangerously simplistic. The focus of psychiatric care began to shift toward more holistic and compassionate approaches, acknowledging that mental illness was a complex, multifaceted issue that could not be solved by manipulating or erasing memories. Treatments began to incorporate an understanding of trauma, personal history, and the profound impact that experiences have on mental health. As new treatments were developed, the idea that memories could be manipulated or erased through hypnosis or suggestion began to lose favor. Techniques such as psychoanalysis, pioneered by Sigmund Freud, introduced a new way of understanding the relationship between the unconscious mind and mental illness. Rather than erasing memories, psychoanalysis sought to uncover repressed memories and bring them to the surface, allowing patients to confront and process their trauma. This approach, though still controversial in some circles, represented a significant departure from the harmful practices of the past, emphasizing the importance of understanding and integrating one's memories, rather than attempting to eliminate or alter them. The experiments at the Vienna Asylum also had a profound impact on the way society viewed mental illness. The stigma surrounding mental health issues was slowly beginning to change, and the public's perception of psychiatric care began to evolve. Prior to this time, individuals with mental illnesses were often marginalized and subjected to cruel treatments in asylums, where they were treated as little more than objects of scientific experimentation. The abuses that took place in Vienna, when they were eventually revealed, shone a light on the failures of the mental health system and pushed society to demand better care and treatment for those suffering from psychiatric disorders. Public outrage at the Vienna Asylum's experiments fueled a larger movement toward mental health reform, which led to the development of more humane and ethical standards for psychiatric treatment. The concept of patient rights, once largely ignored, became a critical part of the conversation surrounding mental health care. Advocacy groups and mental health professionals began to work together to raise awareness of the need for better conditions in psychiatric institutions and to push for greater accountability in the treatment of patients. This shift toward greater compassion and respect for patients was pivotal in transforming the way mental health care was provided in the 20th century and beyond. In addition to changing the way mental health was approached in medical settings, the Vienna Asylum's experiments also left a lasting imprint on the field of ethics in medicine. The principle of do no harm became a foundational guideline for medical practice, particularly in the realm of psychiatry. Medical professionals were now required to consider not only the potential benefits of a treatment, but also the risks and potential harm it could cause. This shift in thinking helped prevent further abuses in the psychiatric field, ensuring that patients were treated with respect, dignity, and care. Despite the harmful practices that took place in the Vienna Asylum, it is important to recognize that they contributed to the eventual evolution of modern psychiatric care. The dark history of memory manipulation, while tragic, served as a lesson for the future of the field. The ethical lapses of the past sparked an important conversation about patient rights, treatment standards, and the dangers of unchecked medical experimentation. These conversations laid the groundwork for the more humane, patient-centered approaches to mental health care that would follow, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. In this sense, the legacy of the Vienna Asylum, while marred by the suffering it caused, became a driving force behind the changes that reshaped the psychiatric profession. Through the suffering of those who underwent the experiments, the field learned the importance of respecting the autonomy and dignity of patients, and the necessity of ethical considerations in all medical practices. The Vienna Asylum story serves as a cautionary tale, but it also reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and healing must always be tempered with a deep respect for the humanity of those who seek help. As psychiatry continues to evolve in the 21st century, the lessons from Vienna remain a critical part of the ongoing dialogue about the ethical treatment of patients. Today, medical professionals are guided by ethical standards that prioritize patient well-being, informed consent, and respect for human dignity. Though the Vienna Asylum's experiments were an example of the worst excesses of medical experimentation, they ultimately played a crucial role in the development of ethical practices in psychiatry and medicine at large. Their legacy lives on in the ethical principles that continue to guide the care and treatment of individuals with mental health challenges, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. As the dark history of the Vienna Asylum's memory manipulation experiments gradually faded from public consciousness, the wider impact of these experiments continued to influence psychiatric practice, medical ethics, and public policy in ways that were often subtle but profound. While the asylum scandal was not widely known for decades, its legacy still reverberated across generations of medical professionals and patients, shaping the way mental health treatment would evolve in the 20th century and beyond. The traumatic experiments, and the subsequent realization of their ethical and psychological consequences, were crucial in defining the boundaries of psychiatric practice, forcing society to reconsider the role of authority, autonomy, and human rights in medical treatment. One of the most enduring consequences of the Vienna Asylum experiments was the emergence of patient advocacy and the increasing importance of patient autonomy within medical practice. The victims of the asylum's memory manipulation procedures were not simply anonymous patients. They were individuals whose identities had been manipulated, whose lives had been disfigured by the unchecked power of medical authorities. It became clear that these patients had been treated as objects of scientific curiosity, rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. This realization helped fuel the broader movement for patient rights that began to take root in the mid-20th century, as people began to understand that the right to self-determination and informed consent was fundamental to the doctor-patient relationship. The growing recognition of the Vienna Asylum's abuses led to a significant shift in the way mental health professionals and society at large approached the treatment of individuals with psychiatric disorders. Over time, the practice of psychiatry began to emphasize the importance of collaboration between physician and patient, rather than the paternalistic, top-down approach that had dominated earlier practices. Doctors could no longer simply impose treatments upon patients without their understanding or consent. A new ethical standard emerged. Patients must be fully informed of the risks, benefits, and alternatives to any treatment, and they must actively participate in decisions about their care. This development was essential in preserving patient dignity and ensuring that medical practitioners acted in the best interests of those they treated. Informed consent, a concept that had been largely ignored in the context of the Vienna Asylum's experiments, became a cornerstone of modern medical practice. This principle emphasized the importance of empowering patients to make decisions about their own care, based on an understanding of the potential outcomes and risks involved. It marked a stark contrast to the days when patients were often treated as passive subjects of medical experimentation. The Vienna Asylum story served as a grim reminder of the consequences of failing to secure informed consent, a failure that had caused irreversible harm to those whose memories were altered, leaving them with a fractured sense of self. The emphasis on patient rights was complemented by a growing recognition of the need for ethical oversight in psychiatric institutions. In the aftermath of the Vienna Asylum's experiments, numerous reforms were introduced to prevent future abuses. These reforms included the establishment of ethical review boards, which were tasked with ensuring that medical experiments, especially those involving vulnerable populations, were conducted in accordance with established ethical guidelines. These boards, composed of medical professionals, ethicists, and patient advocates, were designed to provide an additional layer of protection for patients, ensuring that their rights were not violated in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The legacy of the Vienna Asylum's unethical experiments was not only felt in the realm of psychiatry but also influenced the broader field of medical research, encouraging stricter guidelines and a more patient-centered approach to clinical trials. Alongside these changes in medical ethics, there was also a growing understanding of the complexity of mental health and the limitations of earlier treatments. The 20th century witnessed the rise of more nuanced and humane approaches to psychiatric care, many of which were informed by the mistakes of the past. Psychoanalysis, introduced by Sigmund Freud, played a key role in reshaping the way mental health professionals viewed the relationship between trauma, memory, and identity. Rather than focusing on the manipulation or erasure of memories, psychoanalysis sought to help individuals confront and integrate their traumatic memories, providing a pathway for healing without distorting the past. While psychoanalysis itself faced criticism in later years, its emphasis on understanding and processing memory laid the groundwork for more modern therapeutic approaches that recognize the centrality of memory to mental health. In parallel, the development of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, in the mid-20th century revolutionized the way mental health conditions were treated. CBT emphasized the importance of thought patterns and cognitive distortions in shaping emotional responses and behaviors, encouraging patients to challenge negative thinking and replace it with healthier, more adaptive thought processes. While CBT did not focus on memory manipulation, it provided a framework for understanding how memories, beliefs, and perceptions influence mental well-being. CBT was rooted in the idea that patients could actively participate in their own healing process, working collaboratively with therapists to address the underlying cognitive patterns that contributed to their distress. This shift toward more collaborative, patient-centered care represented a significant departure from the authoritarian approach that had dominated the Vienna Asylum's treatments.